So obviously there is no way that we could have done this pipeline meeting without talking about COVID, right? And, when we were thinking about it, having lived through these last 2 years, it occurred to me, and I'm sure that it has occurred to many of you, that people's perception of truth and science and, trust have changed. Sometimes for the better, sometimes for the worse. So like, what kind of occurred to me is everybody knows what a clinical trial is now. Everybody knows what a placebo is now. So we don't, have to explain those things as much as we used to. But on the other hand, everybody has certain feelings about clinical trials and placebos and whether trials actually tell you the truth or don't tell you the truth. And when you stand in front of somebody and say, but this is what the clinical trial showed, some people have a positive reaction to that, and some people may actually have a much more negative reaction to that. So I'm just going to start out going down the panel and asking our panelists who, some of them are in the trenches talking to patients about new therapies and clinical trials, what their perspective is. So Ed, why don't you go first?
Sure, I'm glad to, Jackie. Yeah, and I didn't say that before, but I do a lot of clinical trials. So I've lived through it with a lot of other people during the last few years. And I will say this from just looking at the topic, when I first saw this, it never dawned on me that COVID might have helped with clinical trials and drug development. I think it's been hard. It's like, it's been hurting. Seems like a bigger, it's easy to talk about that. So I won't, I think from the hurting part, just from our point of view, is it is really, it's multiplied the administrative burden of putting on getting the trials together, right? It's been really hard because, our university, I work at Washington University in St. Louis, and, it's really made it a lot more difficult. There's so many more steps to go through, right? To check all the boxes for COVID on top of the other things. And we all know the clinical trials are pretty regulatory heavy to begin with. So I just think something that would have, taken a certain amount of time, probably takes, I would say 3 or 4 times longer to get through our administrative process. And, people are stretched thin, they're not coming into work. There's a lot of different workflows that have changed. So that's the first thing. And that's the part of my job I don't really like. So it kind of stands out as it's been really hard. I think.
So would you say, I'm going to, put your feet to the fire.
No.
In terms of time to be able to open a trial? This is what these people want to know.
Yes.
Before and after.
Yeah. So before, and it depends, of course, I'll 3 to 4 months probably before. And during COVID, it took like 2 years, right? We got nothing done during COVID. It took forever. Like, and things got stopped and we couldn't see patients for a while. And so now I think we're coming back from that. I think it's gotten a lot better. I think, the people are starting to understand what they have to put together. I don't think it's back to where it was when we started, but I think it's getting better than it was in the midst of things. So,
all right, Elaine.
Yeah, so I think first of all, I think families are with children who, in my experience with refractory epilepsy, are actually very, very happy to be part of a clinical trial and really want that scientific evidence. And I think, one of the questions when the Epidiolex trials came out was, people, were they just going to go get cannabidiol somewhere, or were they actually going to participate in the trials? And the families that I talked to were really wanting that scientific evidence. And so I think people are very, very keen to understand if this really works, and they are very keen to participate in clinical trials. I certainly would agree with Ed with the administrative burden being a lot more challenging. And I think the other thing, particularly families of children with severe epilepsy and often other disabilities, many of those families travel quite a distance with their child to come in for the clinical trial. And I think that's, in the height of COVID, and even now, it's very worrisome, bringing your child through an airport, putting them on a plane. Many of these children are not very great at mask wearing. And I think just the potential risk to that child of coming in for the clinical trial is not inconsequential. And so, how do they make the best decision for their child? Here's a therapy that might be beneficial, but yet what is the risk of the child contracting COVID on the way to the clinical trial?
I do clinical trials also, obviously, and I certainly have seen patients who say, I'm not ready to come into the center now. I'm going to wait. And hands up, have people? Yeah. Okay. Kate?
Sure. So as I mentioned, I'm on the adult side, and not to repeat other people's experiences, which have been very similar. I think to take the positive route, I think the majority of patients are actually more interested in getting more information, and at this point seem very interested in participating in clinical trials or starting a new medication, and really want to know a lot of the details leading to the approval of the medication and why I may be recommending that for that individual. There's certainly the other side of, and that seems to be, as we all know, a vocal majority that maybe aren't interested and remain skeptical of being studied as a participant in a study. And I'm not sure if that really is new. It just may be something that we're noticing more and verbalizing and discussing in a different way than we did before. So I'm optimistic. In recent months, it seems like it's kind of getting back more towards the normal discussions, and even on a very positive note that patients and their families seem to understand clinical trials more and want to discuss them and have a enthusiasm about participating. I will also, back up the statements about worry about coming in for more tests at certain points during the pandemic. That was a really legitimate concern that I shared because some of these patients were more vulnerable, and more exposure in the hospital setting may honestly not be the right time. So
Now we're going to hear from the other side of the aisle.
Yeah, so I think in the short term, COVID definitely was hurting clinical trials, mostly because of the fear of participating during a pandemic. It very much has hurt the recruitment of an ongoing clinical trial that Cerevel Therapeutics is running in drug-resistant focal seizures. So in the short term, I think definitely has hurt. But in the long term, I do see that there will be benefit. I think companies like mine were forced to think outside of the box as to how to collect our data and keep our patients safe at the same time by introducing more remote options. And while these mitigations and these options have been around in the industry for a while, they haven't been readily adopted. So I think it forced people to sort of say, what can we do? How can we shift our mindset, start collecting these things remotely? Can we cut down on the visit burden, which are things we should have been doing from the get-go, but we were forced into that new mindset. So in the long term, I think there's probably going to be some great benefits for clinical trials coming out of this pandemic.
Well, that is the most hopeful thing I've ever heard.
I'm a glass half full kind of person, so.
Kim, any other comments as you hear what everybody else is saying?
I mean, I think from the patient perspective, there's always that risk versus benefit, and COVID is another risk, right? And a significant risk that families are weighing. From the foundation standpoint, a lot of us are working hard to do things like natural history studies, and those really did get shut down during COVID, and that slows our timeline in terms of having that data for drug trials, and especially in the rare disease space.
Yeah, Tracy Dixon Salazar actually at the Research Roundtable tragically told us that her daughter had been essentially seizure-free for 20 years, I think, until she developed COVID, and now she's seizing again. So there is a consequence there.